Morning.
Director Wray, I want to ask you a little bit about some of your testimony about the border. Last year, 169 individuals on the terrorist watch list were detained at the southern border. So far this year, it's been 58. We know there were, since 2021, approximately 1.8 million gotaways. In other words, not people that turn themselves in claiming asylum, not people paroled into the interior, but 1.8 million migrants who were evading law enforcement at the border. Can you tell us, can you tell the American people with any certainty that there are 0 people on the terrorist watch list that were among that 1.8 million gotaways?
Well, what I would say is you, I think, rightly highlighted the kind of what you remember Secretary Rumsfeld used to refer to the known known, the known unknown, and the unknown unknown. And I think here, in many ways, the national security ramifications of the issues at the border are better reflected in some ways more by what we don't know about the people who snuck in, provided fake documents, or in some other way got in when there wasn't sufficient information available at the time they came in to connect the dots is almost more significant in our view than the actual number of so-called KSTs, because those people, for the most part, are stopped, detained, and processed appropriately.
And I guess you would answer the same way that people with criminal records, members of criminal street gangs and others being among that 1.8 million figure for migrants who got away. We don't know what that 1.8 million is composed of, do we?
That's correct.
What we do know is that more than 37,000 Chinese nationals were detained at the U.S. southern border in 2023. That number's up 10 times over the earlier tally. And these individuals who were, of course, detained, sometimes they claim asylum, sometimes they're paroled into the interior. But again, we don't know how many Chinese nationals that may be among that 1.8 million gotaways that have made their way into the interior of the United States. You would answer the same way.
Right. We don't know what we're dealing with. In that particular context, it gets especially challenging because presumably within that group, you've got not only people who may mean us harm, but also people who are fleeing the CCP and share our concerns about their authoritarian thuggishness.
Of course, that's an important point. I'm not suggesting all of them are, but I'm just suggesting this is a huge gaping vulnerability in our national security that we don't have answers for. I'm reminded that there were 26 co-conspirators in the 9/11 attacks against the United States, killing 3,000 people. 26 people killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. I worry that among the people that are coming across the border that are evading law enforcement, that there are some people among those that mean to do us harm. Do you share that concern?
I do.
And in fact, according to public sources, this is CNN, August 30, 2023, you alluded to this earlier about dozens of migrants from Uzbekistan that were being facilitated by a suspected ISIS agent in Turkey that was assisting those migrants to make their way to the southern border and into the United States, correct?
So that's a threat stream that we're very concerned about. We're very actively investigating, working with DHS on both people whose travel was facilitated, but also members of the facilitation network in some other way overseas. There's probably more I could share on that in closed session if you would like.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that I think this reveals is that our border situation, the illegal immigration, has changed over the years. It seems to me, coming from a border state, years ago, you would look at people coming across who wanted to work, wanted to provide for their family. Now, of course, we understand people fleeing violence and poverty, things like that. But also, we see the pull factors, the fact that if you make it to the border, you can likely stay for the rest of your natural life is an enormous magnet for people to come, but also, and not just people who have benign intentions toward the United States who want a better life, but also people that want to do us harm. I know sometimes people say, well, this is just a fantastic theory. It's no basis in reality. Do you consider that to be a frivolous consideration?
I do not. And I've been, I think, very vocal about this. We, of course, are not responsible, FBI, for the physical security of the border. We work hard to be good partners with DHS on that. But there are a whole host of threats that emanate from the border, and some of them are criminal threats. We talked about fentanyl and violence. And then, of course, we have concerns that it could be a vulnerability that terrorist organizations could seek to exploit. I would add that we are not at the moment tracking any specific terrorist plot coming across the border in that regard, but it wasn't that long ago, as you will recall, that we had indictments of an individual who was trying to smuggle foreign nationals across the border to assassinate former President Bush. So it goes to your point that numbers are important, but numbers don't tell the whole story. It only takes a few people who can be responsible for a whole lot of harm.
Senator Bennett.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for your service. Director Burns, the FBI director, just mentioned President Bush. I think you were our ambassador to Russia when he was president. Is that right? And
yes, sir.
You
yes,
have
sir.
one of the longest distinguished careers in American diplomacy, and now you're in the middle of a negotiation in the Middle East that I think everybody up here hopes that you're going to be successful about. In that context, I want to ask you about the supplemental bill that has the Ukraine funding in it. That's a bill that passed out of the Senate with 70 votes. We almost don't pass anything around here with 70 votes. A broad bipartisan recognition of the importance of that bill. I agree with your assessment and the intelligence community's assessment that Ukraine has the possibility to prevail in this conflict with Russia. Nobody 2 years ago would have believed that, but the way they fought, the way they've been able to be supported by our munitions and our intelligence, obviously has made a difference, but they have succeeded in ways nobody could have imagined. There are people here, and there are people in the House that don't believe that. They don't, their assessment is different than the intelligence community. Their judgment is different, and that's fine. We have different judgments. But I would ask you, since you're here, a little bit about the negotiating posture that Ukraine, the West, NATO wants to put ourselves in with Vladimir Putin. And considering that question, I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about whether or not our negotiating position, if you're somebody who believes in the end that somehow Ukraine can't prevail, although I believe they can, and believes only that they can be in a position to negotiate an end to this, why it would be better for us to pass the supplemental from that vantage point than to fail to pass the supplemental?
No, thanks very much, Senator. I mean, I think today, first, I'll start with Vladimir Putin and Russia. It's our assessment that Russia is not serious about negotiations today in the sense that they may be interested in the theater of negotiations, but they're not really interested in negotiating in the sense of compromise right now. Because, as Director Haynes said in her opening remarks, I think President Putin believes that time is on his side, that he can grind down the Ukrainians and wear down the rest of us. So if you look at the prospect of a more serious negotiation in the future, it's essential for Ukraine, first with our support, to disabuse the Russian leadership of the notion. In other words, to puncture his confidence that time's on his side, to demonstrate that for Russia also there are long-term consequences to this war. They've already suffered enormously in terms of their military, 315,000 plus dead and wounded, 4 times the casualties that the Soviet Union suffered in a decade of war in Afghanistan, the destruction of something on the order of 2/3 of their pre-war tank inventory, and long-term economic consequences, which, is fast making Russia the economic vassal of China. Not to mention a much stronger and bigger NATO that they have to face today. So the challenge in 2024 is helping the Ukrainians not just to hold their own, but to continue to impose costs so that they'd be in a position of greater strength, greater leverage in a negotiation. And I think that would be my answer to that question. If you want to get to a serious negotiation, you have to help the Ukrainians demonstrate that Putin's wrong in his notion that time is on his side.
That logic seems fairly compelling to me. Let me ask you another question. Since you served Republican and Democratic presidents over many decades, you hear people in this building say that the United States of America has to give up on our support for Ukraine in actual conflict with Vladimir Putin, an actual conflict with Russia, because of the fear that we will not be able to afford some plausible, but nevertheless theoretical conflict with China in the future. Do you believe the United States of America cannot handle our commitments with respect to Ukraine and NATO and be able to deter Beijing as well?
No, I don't believe that. I think we're entirely capable. I mean, Senator Rubio said this earlier. I think the United States, while we may not have uncontested primacy in the world today, we still have a stronger hand to play than any of our adversaries or rivals. So I believe we're entirely capable of continuing to support Ukraine in a conflict that has consequences well beyond Ukraine and European security. And I think sustaining that support for Ukraine not only doesn't come at the expense of deterring China, it actually helps to deter China, whether it's in Taiwan or the South China Sea or other places. It is our assessment that Xi Jinping was sobered, by what happened, especially in the first year of the war. He didn't expect that Ukraine would resist with the courage and tenacity that the Ukrainians demonstrated. He didn't expect that the United States, whom he believes is a declining power, would step up in the way the president has led, with all of your support, to show solidarity with Ukraine as well. That's had an impact, I believe, far beyond Ukraine or European security, and that's really what's at stake today.
And I would say we'd look back, Mr. Chairman, at that $60 billion and say that it was a bargain compared to what we would otherwise spend. Mr. Chairman, my colleagues, I think almost all of them went over a minute and a half. So let me just say in the last 15 seconds that I have, that our threat assessment mentioned—
I think the record will stand corrected. You get a couple seconds, but we've been holding here.
Director Haynes, well, I'll take it for the record, but there is in the document reference to the serious issues that we're confronting in space right now. And had I more time to ask you about that, we'd have a conversation.
You'll get a chance in classified. Senator Moran.
Chairman Warner, thank you. Director Burns, I was in Mexico about a year ago and met with President Lopez Obrador, and my request, among others, was that he personally intervene with Chinese leadership and ask for the precursors to not be imported into Mexico and thereby utilized and ultimately end up as fentanyl in the United States. He committed to doing that. My understanding from his government as well as public sources is that he did. And then there seemed to be some level of interest on the part of China in negotiating with us or having conversations with the United States about that topic. I don't know that much has come from that, but you may tell me that I'm wrong. What explains the Chinese unwillingness to be more proactive in combating precursor chemicals coming to the U.S.? Is this, do they have the capability? They intentionally inflicting harm on Americans in America? Is there some quid pro quo that they're looking for?
No, I think, Senator, since the president met with President Xi in November in California, there have been some signs of, greater Chinese seriousness about dealing with this problem, effectively enforcing their own law, because that's all that we're asking. When I was in Beijing in late May of last year, I raised this issue very directly with my counterparts as well. And so I think there are some signs that the Chinese are beginning to address the problem, not just of precursor chemicals, but also of pill pressing equipment. Certainly they can do more, and I think that's why it's so important for all of us to continue to push as hard as we can, and to make clear, as you indicated earlier, that this is a problem not only for the United States, but for Mexico and for others around the world.
So what would be China's reluctance to actually crack down on those exports?
Well, I mean, I hope that what you're seeing now is a readiness to do more, I think, since November. But I think, that's something that obviously from the president on down, we need to continue to reinforce as hard as we can, because they do bear some responsibility for what's happening in our own society.
General Cruz, how do you assess the current balance of military power between in the Pacific today, the United States and China and others?
I think I would describe the balance of power today as China is on a rise, that it has been planning for multiple five-year periods, and it has executed that development, that training, that exercising in a way that has put them in a position that at some point in the not-too-distant future, in accordance with Xi's own goals, they will be a world-leading military power. The United States, though, is the world's leading military power today, and so the imperative piece for us is to be on that same trajectory to match them stride for stride and ensure we stay ahead of the growth that we see in China. But there is no doubt the growth that you see and has been discussed today in military power associated with China and the rise in all domains, cyberspace as well as conventional.
Director Haynes, has Iran sought to use our borders, our porous borders, to conduct terrorist activities in the United States?
Yeah, we have a very good example of Iran supporting, in effect, efforts to come across the border to go after a former ambassador from Saudi Arabia, for example. There was a case against our Bobs here in that scenario. So they have historically attempted this, but it's actually been very challenging for them and something that we consistently monitor on a regular basis. They prefer to go through, to the extent that they're able, criminal entities and other groups as a way of trying to achieve their goals.
Director Wray, there was reports of our military technologies being utilized in North Korean military equipment found in Ukraine coming from Russia. How do we explain that?
Well, I'm definitely tracking a similar instance in terms of Iranian drones, for example, where U.S. technology has appeared as components. I think part of it has to do with dual-use technologies and companies here not being perhaps as vigilant as they need to be about the potential uses of their technologies. And so, we're trying to be very heavily engaged with the private sector to make sure that they're more thoughtful about who they're selling to and where their pieces and components may end up.
Senator
Casey,
Warner, even though you gave Senator Bennett additional time, I'll not ask for any.
you're a very generous member. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I want to thank the panel for your testimony today and also for your public service. I'm going to follow up on the fentanyl, and I want to ask a related question about xylazine. I know our colleagues have mentioned and asked questions about fentanyl. But I'll start with Director Wray to direct your attention to this question about fentanyl. The threat assessment this year on page 36 says that, quote, China remains the primary source for illicit fentanyl precursor chemicals in pill press equipment, unquote, and then it goes on to talk about what the cartels do. It's noteworthy, I think, that the U.S. Sentencing Commission told us that in fiscal year 2022, 88% of fentanyl trafficking offenders were U.S. citizens, 88%. In fiscal year 21, 86% of fentanyl trafficking offenders were U.S. citizens. But we know how it gets here. We have a pretty good sense of how it gets here. We also know the administration announced that it had made progress, they believe some progress in reestablishing coordination with the Chinese government on countering fentanyl. I'm increasingly concerned as well about xylazine and other non-fentanyl synthetic opioids. Xylazine, as many people know, is a powerful veterinary sedative that is mixed with illicit fentanyl, and unfortunately the city of Philadelphia has become almost ground zero for the proliferation of illicit xylazine. According to DEA, xylazine was detected in nearly half of all fentanyl-related overdoses in Philly. So, Director Wray, I wanted to ask you, is the Chinese government holding up its end of the bargain in cracking down on illicit fentanyl traffickers?
Well, I would say the scale of the problem that we're continuing to see suggests to me that there's a whole lot of room for improvement from the Chinese government. Let me just put it that way. You mentioned xylazine. Certainly, xylazine is of concern to us. You're right that the Philadelphia area is a place where we're seeing a certain amount of that. We've got a lot of investigations in the Philadelphia and Newark areas. Of course, one of the problems with xylazine, as you I'm sure know, is it's not responsive to Narcan. Mm-hmm. So that just adds to the challenge. And certainly, xylazine's been found in drug combinations, and I think maybe 48 of the 50 states or something, and it's very easy to buy, unfortunately, online from China-based suppliers. So I think that just adds to the problem. We are, in addition to our investigative work, trying to engage in your area and nearby areas with hospitals and state diversion groups and things like that to try to raise awareness about it. But xylazine is not a controlled substance currently under the U.S. Controlled Substances Act, so that's just an additional kind of aggravating circumstance.
And also a related question, to what extent is regulation by China of xylazine and other non-fentanyl synthetic opioids part of U.S. law enforcement's discussions with their Chinese counterparts?
Certainly, trying to work with the Chinese on their controlled substances listings is a key part of it. Part of the problem with precursors, of course, is that there's an almost infinite number of variations that people can come up with. So even if when they schedule things, you see new ones, crop up in their stead. And so I think that just adds to the challenge. You ask how serious are they? I would just point to the sheer volume that we're contending with. And I think that tells you all you need to know about how serious the Chinese are so far in helping us address the problem.
And Director Haynes, I want to ask you about Iranian evasion of sanctions. We know that since the imposition of increased sanctions against Iranian oil in 2018 and 19, Iran has been increasingly successful in finding ways to evade sanctions, and its oil revenues are increasingly rising. I know the administration's focus on blocking Iran's oil exports. How is the intelligence community supporting the administration's efforts to impose further costs on Iran, including by focusing on identifying and sanctioning so-called ghost fleet vessels carrying Iranian oil and Chinese refineries purchasing Iranian oil?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I mean, we're very involved is the short answer, but the longer answer, and we actually do periodic reports to Congress that tell you about some of the work that we do in this area where we're identifying where we see sanctions evasion, where we see opportunities for essentially additional targets for sanctions that might be acted on, that are sort of third parties or others who are involved in these transactions so that the Treasury Department and others can, in fact, go after them in that respect. And it's a constant and critical issue.